The midday heat beat down fiercely as I crouched beside Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rose bushes, my hands already smeared with mud, sweat pouring down my brow. At 27, I had believed my life was sorted out, a good job at an accounting firm, a consistent girlfriend named Sarah, and a predictable routine that kept me safely within society's standards. But kneeling in Ella Laner Henderson's garden, watching her delicate movements as she tended to her flowers, I felt something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name. Ella Laner, 43, was a widow who had lost her husband in a car accident 2 years earlier, a tragedy that had shaken the entire neighborhood. She lived in the colonial house next to my apartment complex, and I'd offered to help with her garden after seeing her struggle with the heavier tasks. It seemed like the neighborly thing to do. What I hadn't expected was how my heart raced every time she smiled at me, or how I began to look forward to our Saturday gardening sessions with a fervor that felt almost like addiction. "You're getting dirt all over your good clothes," she said, her voice soft and concerned, making my chest clench. She wore a simple yellow sundress dotted with little white flowers, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose ponytail that revealed the graceful curve of her neck. Something about the way the light caught her emerald eyes made me forget everything else, my job, my girlfriend, the pile of tax returns waiting on my desk. "I don't mind," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I worked the soil around the rose roots. "These bushes are worth getting messy for. They're beautiful." Ella Laner paused her weeding, a faint smile touching the corners of her lips. "My grandmother planted them when she first moved here in 1952. Robert always said they were why he fell in love with this house." Her gaze grew distant, and I noticed her thumb absently twisting the wedding ring she still wore. Mention of her late husband should have reminded me of the boundaries, the respect owed to his memory, the social rules that governed interactions like ours. Instead, I felt a sharp stab of jealousy for a dead man who'd had the privilege of waking up beside Ella Laner every morning, seeing her hair spread across a pillow, earning those gentle smiles. "He had good taste," I said, and immediately regretted it. The double meaning hung in the air between us, and I saw Ella Laner's cheeks flush faintly. "Yes," she replied softly. "He did." We worked in silence for a while, the tension between us building like electricity before a storm. Every accidental brush of our hands as we reached for the same tool sent shocks through my system. Every time she bent down to inspect a plant, I caught sight of the curve of her waist, the way her dress swayed with her movement, and I had to force myself to look away before my thoughts wandered into dangerous territory. "I should probably get some water," Ella Laner said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "Would you like some lemonade? I made it fresh this morning." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and watched her walk toward the house. Her walk was confident and feminine, hypnotic in its grace, and she seemed completely unaware of it. As she disappeared through the back door, I sat back on my heels, trying to collect myself. This was dangerous territory. Ella Laner Henderson was my neighbor, a widow still grieving her husband, and I was a man in a committed relationship. The fact that I spent my Saturday afternoons longing for her smile instead of thinking about my fiancé should have been a glaring red flag. But there was something about Ella Laner that pulled me in like a moth to a flame, making all my careful plans and moral certainty feel suddenly fragile. When she returned with 2 glasses of lemonade, her hair had slipped loose from its ponytail, a few strands framing her face in a way that made my pulse stutter. She handed me the glass, and our fingertips touched during the exchange. Neither of us pulled away immediately. "You know," she said, sitting on the garden bench and sipping her drink, "I really appreciate you helping me with all of this. I know you must have better things to do on your weekends." "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," I said, and the honesty in my own tone surprised me. Her eyes flickered with something, surprise, or understanding of the deeper meaning behind my words. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavily in the June breeze. Then she glanced away, her gaze settling on the rose bushes we'd been tending. "Robert used to love gardening," she said, her voice quieter now. "Said it was the only place he could think clearly. Sometimes I come out here in the evenings just to feel close to him again." The mention of her husband was like a cold shower, dousing me with reminders of why the feelings growing in me were wrong. But even as guilt twisted in my stomach, I couldn't shake the sense that something had begun between us, something that would change everything if we let it. We went back to work, but the atmosphere had shifted. Every conversation felt loaded, every glance held a moment too long. When Ella Laner asked me to help move a heavy planter, I found myself standing behind her, my hands on either side of hers as we lifted it together. The scent of her perfume, something light and floral, filled my senses, and I had to fight the urge to lean closer and breathe her in. As we set the planter down, she turned toward me, and suddenly we were standing very close. Close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Close enough that one small movement would bring our lips together. The pause between us stretched, tense with possibility and risk. I could see the quick rise and fall of her chest, feel the warmth coming from her skin. Every part of me wanted to close the distance, to finally surrender to the attraction that had been building for weeks. But instead, I took a step back, creating a space that felt both necessary and painful. "I should probably head home," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "Sarah's making dinner tonight." Mention of my girlfriend's name hung in the air like an accusation. Elena nodded, but not before I saw a flicker of something, disappointment, or maybe relief, cross her face. "Of course," she replied, her tone perfectly neutral. "Thank you again for all your help." "Same time next Saturday?" I said, knowing I should say no, knowing that coming back would only make things more complicated. But the thought of not seeing her again, of giving up these stolen afternoons in her garden, was unbearable. Walking home, dirt under my fingernails and the scent of her perfume lingering on my clothes, I tried to tell myself nothing had happened. We were just neighbors helping each other out. The tension I felt was all in my head, a product of too much sun and not enough sleep. But deep down, I knew I was lying. Something had changed between Elena and me that afternoon, something that couldn't be undone by good intentions or moral reasoning. And that night, lying in bed beside Sarah, listening to her breathe as I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Elena's emerald eyes and the way she had looked at me in her garden. A dangerous seed had been planted, and I could feel it taking root. The following Saturday couldn't come soon enough. All week, I was distracted at work, making careless errors in spreadsheets and missing details in client meetings. Sarah noticed my distraction during our Wednesday dinner date, commenting that I seemed somewhere else entirely. If only she knew how right she was. I showed up at Elena's house earlier than usual, telling myself it was just to get a head start on the gardening. The truth was, I'd been awake since sunrise, torn equally between eagerness and guilt. Elena answered the door in a pale blue sundress that matched her eyes perfectly, and I had to grip my gardening tools tightly to keep my hands from shaking. "You're early," she said, though her tone was warm, suggesting she didn't mind. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, then immediately wished I hadn't. It revealed too much. She studied my face for a moment, and I saw a spark of understanding in her eyes. "Neither could I," she said quietly. For the first hour, we worked side by side, talking carefully about safe topics, the weather, neighborhood news, the progress of her tomatoes. But there was an electric undercurrent beneath it all, making every simple exchange feel significant. When she asked me to help stake a climbing rose that had outgrown its trellis, I found myself behind her once more, my arms reaching around her to secure the vine. "Is this too tight?" I asked, fastening the garden wire. "It's perfect," she murmured, and something in her tone made me still. She hadn't stepped away or created the space politeness demanded. Instead, she leaned back slightly, and I felt the warmth of her body against mine for one breathless second before my conscience took over and I moved back. The morning passed in a blur of fleeting glances and accidental touches. Every time our hands brushed reaching for the same tool, every time she smiled at something I said, I felt myself sinking deeper into something I didn't know how to name. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was the way she listened when I talked about my struggles at work, as if she truly cared what I thought. Sarah had stopped really listening to me months ago. Our conversations had become more about logistics and routine. Around noon, Elena suggested we break for lunch. She'd made sandwiches and iced tea, and we sat on her back porch in the shade of the large oak tree that dominated her yard. Our conversation drifted toward more personal things, her life before Robert's death, my own doubts about the future. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" she asked suddenly, her emerald eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "What do you mean? Do you ever wake up and wonder how you got here? Whether the choices you made were really yours, or if you were just following the path everyone expected you to take?" Her question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. My relationship with Sarah had started in college. It was easy, expected. My job was stable but unfulfilling. My whole life had been built around other people's ideas of what should make me happy. "Do you?" I asked softly. Elena sighed with a longing that made my chest ache. "Robert and I married when I was 22. He was a good man, a wonderful husband, but sometimes I wonder who I might have been if I'd had more time to find myself first. She gestured vaguely at the space around us. I went from my father's house to my husband's house. Now, at 43, I feel like I'm just learning who I really am. There was a raw vulnerability in her confession that made me want to reach for her hand, to offer comfort beyond words. Instead, I gripped my iced tea glass tightly, trying to hold on to the shaky boundaries we'd set. "You're still young," I said. 43 isn't old. She laughed, but the sound was sad. Tell that to my mirror. Tell that to all the years I spent being who everyone else wanted instead of who I wanted to be. Who do you want to be? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. Ella Laner looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression, as if she were making a decision, or stepping toward a line. I want to be someone who takes chances. Someone who doesn't let fear make her choices for her. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify around us, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. We both knew we were talking about more than philosophy. When we returned to gardening, the mood had shifted completely. Every gesture felt intentional, every word carried weight. Ella Laner asked me to help her plant new bulbs in the flower bed beneath her bedroom window. As we worked side by side, our conversation grew more intimate. Robert wanted children, she said abruptly, her hands still in the soil. I wasn't sure I was ready, and we kept putting it off, thinking we had time. After he died, I learned that not all opportunities wait for you to be ready. Do you regret it? Not having children? Sometimes. But mostly, I regret not living more fully when I had the chance. I was so worried about doing the right thing, meeting expectations, that I forgot to ask myself what I really wanted. Her words echoed my own growing restlessness, my feeling that I was sleepwalking through a life that didn't fit. She looked up at me as if she could read my thoughts. What about you? Are you happy with Sarah? The question should have been off limits, too personal, too dangerous. But Ella Laner's tone made it feel like a confessional, a safe space where honesty was not just allowed, but welcomed. I thought I was, I admitted quietly. Lately, I'm not sure what happiness is supposed to feel like. Ella Laner nodded as if she understood perfectly. When Robert died, everyone told me how lucky I was to have had such a good marriage, such a stable life. And I was grateful. But I also realized stable and happy aren't always the same thing. As the day wore on, our work took us to a far corner of her garden, partially hidden from the house and street by tall hedges. Everything changed when we tried to clear a patch of stubborn weeds. Ella Laner was working on a tough root when her hand slipped, and she stumbled backward. I caught her instinctively, my arms wrapping around her waist to steady her. For a moment, we stood frozen, her back against my chest, my face close enough to her neck to smell her shampoo. "Thank you," she murmured, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned in my arms until we were face to face, closer than we'd ever been. I could see every gold fleck in her emerald eyes, count the faint freckles across her nose. Her lips were slightly parted, and I could feel her warm breath on my skin. "We should," I started to say, but the words died as she reached up and touched my face, her fingertips tracing my jawline with a tenderness that made my knees weak. "Should what?" she whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know what we should do. Every rational part of my brain was shouting warnings, listing all the reasons this was wrong and how it could only end badly. But Ella Laner's touch felt like coming home, like waking up from a long and dreamless sleep. "If only I were younger," she sighed, her eyes locked on mine. "What if I were 25 again? What if I'd met you then?" "Age doesn't matter," I said, and I meant it. Not to me. Something shifted in her expression, hope, fear, and desire mingling in a way that stole my breath. For a second, I thought she would kiss me. I could see the want in her eyes, feel the tension in her body as she leaned in. But the spell broke when a car door slammed nearby. Ella Laner took a quick step back, her cheeks flushed, her breathing unsteady. We both looked toward the street, but it was only a neighbor coming home with groceries. Still, the moment was gone, and reality returned with sharp clarity. I was committed to someone else. Ella Laner was a widow who still wore her wedding ring. We were both playing with fire. "I should go," I said, though every part of me wanted to stay, to close the distance between us again no matter the cost. Ella Laner nodded, but I saw the conflict in her eyes. "Same time next week?" I knew I should say no. I knew continuing these Saturdays would only make things more complicated and dangerous. But I also knew I couldn't stay away. The thought of not seeing her again was unbearable. "Yes," I said. "Next week." Walking home, my hands unsteady and my heart pounding, I tried to make sense of what had almost happened. We hadn't kissed. We hadn't crossed any physical line that couldn't be uncrossed. But something fundamental had changed between us, something that couldn't be undone by good intentions or moral reasoning. That night, Sarah chatted excitedly about our upcoming vacation, the restaurant reservations she'd made, the activities she'd researched. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the afternoon, every word Ella Laner had spoken, every look we'd shared. When Sarah fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, aware that I was standing at a crossroads. I could step back now, create distance, and let whatever was growing between Ella Laner and me fade into a bittersweet memory. Or I could keep walking this path, knowing it would likely destroy everything I'd built so far. The sensible choice was clear. The safe choice was obvious. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, all I could see were emerald eyes and hear Ella Laner's words, "If only I were younger," as though age were the only thing standing between us and something beautiful. The week felt like a fever dream. Each day brought a new battle between my conscience and my desires. I found myself making excuses to walk past Ella Laner's house on my way to work, hoping for a glimpse of her tending her flowers. I started imagining conversations we might have, scenarios where the obstacles between us simply vanished. Sarah noticed my distraction growing, and by Thursday she was asking pointed questions about where my head had been lately. "You've been acting strange," she said over dinner, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Distant. Like you're always thinking about something else." "Just work stress," I lied, unable to meet her eyes. The guilt was eating me alive, but the alternative, telling her the truth, was unthinkable. Friday night, lying in bed beside Sarah, I made a decision. I would go to Ella Laner's one last time, help her finish the section of garden we'd been working on, and then create some distance. Maybe I'd sign up for weekend overtime at the accounting firm, or suggest that Sarah and I start taking weekend trips out of town, anything to break this dangerous cycle. But when Saturday morning came, my resolve crumbled the moment Ella Laner opened her door. She wore a white sundress that made her skin glow, her hair loose around her shoulders in soft waves. More importantly, there was something new in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. "All week I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice steady. "About age not mattering." My heart began to race. "Ella Laner, don't, let me finish." She stepped closer, her emerald eyes blazing with an intensity that stole my breath. "I've spent the last 2 years grieving Robert, and the 20 years before that being the perfect wife. I'm tired of living up to other people's expectations. I'm tired of being afraid." We worked quietly for the first hour, but the tension between us was palpable. Every accidental touch sent electricity through me. Every time she smiled at something I said, I felt my carefully constructed walls crumbling a little more. When she asked me to help her move a heavy stone border, I found myself standing close behind her, my hands covering hers as we lifted together. This time, she didn't pull away when the task was done. Instead, she leaned back against me, her body warm and soft against my chest. "This is dangerous," I murmured, but my arms tightened around her waist as I said it. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm 43 years old, and I'm tired of playing it safe." She turned in my arms, and we were face to face again, closer than we'd ever been. I could see my own desire reflected in her eyes, feel the rapid rise and fall of her chest against mine. The rational part of my brain was screaming warnings, but they were drowned out by the pounding of my heart. "We can't," I said, but the words held no conviction. "Can't we?" she asked, her hand resting on my chest. "Who says we can't?" The answer seemed obvious: society, morality, my girlfriend sleeping at home, the memory of her late husband. But standing there in the dappled shade of her garden hedge, with the morning sun filtering through the leaves and Ella Laner looking at me as if I were the answer to every prayer she'd never dared to speak, those barriers felt suddenly fragile. "What about Sarah?" I asked, a last attempt to do the right thing. Ella Laner's expression shifted, maybe with guilt, maybe with recognition of the hurt we might cause. But then her jaw set with determination. "What about her?" she asked. "Are you happy with her? Truly happy?" The question hung between us like a challenge. I could have lied, pretended my relationship with Sarah was everything I wanted. But Ella Laner's gaze demanded honesty, and I found I couldn't give her anything less. "No," I said. "I'm not." The admission felt like crossing a line from which there could be no return. Eleanor's eyes softened, and she touched my face with a tenderness that made my knees weak. "Then why are we condemning ourselves for wanting something real?" she asked. Before I could answer, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to mine. The kiss started soft, tentative, as if she were giving me a chance to pull away. But I couldn't pull away anymore. All the weeks of tension, all the stolen glances and careful distances, culminated in a desperate hunger that overwhelmed every rational thought. I kissed her back with a fierceness that surprised us both, my hands tangling in her hair as she pressed closer. She tasted like sunshine and possibility, like every fantasy I'd been afraid to admit. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, I saw tears in her eyes. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," she said, her voice breaking. "So have I admitted, and the truth felt both freeing and terrifying. We stood there holding each other, foreheads touching, trying to process what had just happened. The kiss had changed everything, making it impossible to pretend our feelings were harmless infatuation. "What do we do now?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing patterns on my chest. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've never been in this situation before. Robert was my first and only." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The weight of what she was saying, that I would be the first man she'd been with since her husband died, possibly only the second man in her entire life, hit me like a physical blow. "Eleanor, if you're not ready, I am ready," she said firmly, looking up at me with determined eyes. "I'm more ready for this than I've been for anything in my life." The next hour passed in a blur of passionate kisses and whispered confessions. We tried to focus on the gardening, but it was futile. Every task became an excuse to touch. Every interaction was charged with double meaning. When Eleanor suggested we break for lunch, I knew we were approaching a point of no return. The air inside her house was electric. Eleanor moved around the kitchen making sandwiches, but her hands trembled, and I could see a rapid pulse at the base of her throat. I sat at her kitchen table, trying to grasp the enormity of what was happening between us. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked, setting a plate in front of me. "About kissing you?" "No." "About what this means for the rest of our lives?" "Yes." Eleanor sat across from me, her green eyes serious. "I know this is complicated. I know we're both risking a lot. But I also know I can't go back to pretending I don't feel this way about you. What will people say? The neighbors? Your reputation? My reputation?" She laughed, but the sound was bittersweet. "My reputation is as a heartbroken widow who spends her days alone in her garden. Is that really better than being the woman who found love again?" Her words struck deep, forcing me to confront my own hypocrisy. I was worried about her reputation, about what people would say, but mostly I was worried about my own comfort, my own safety. Eleanor was willing to risk everything for what we felt, while I was still counting costs and consequences. After lunch, we returned to the garden, but the pretense of work had worn thin. Every touch was intentional. Every look held promise. The line we'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed, and we both knew it. Whatever happened next, our lives would never be the same.